She was 6 years old when they stripped her of her name, wrapped her in gold, and shipped her across a war-torn sea. Her wedding dress was sewn to fit a body still learning how to walk in shoes. Her dowry was higher than most kingdoms' treasuries. Her crown weighed more than her spine could bear. And her husband? He was 29 years old, a man desperate for peace, willing to buy it with a child. She smiled because they told her to. She walked because they pushed her forward. She was called Queen of England, but she didn't speak the language, didn't know the rules, didn't even understand what a wedding meant. When he died, she didn't cry. She didn't know how. She just waited in silence, while the adults decided who would own her next. This isn't history. This is a ransom story dressed as a fairy tale. And at the center is a little girl named Isabella, who was never meant to survive it. In the 1390s, England and France were locked in the bitter, unrelenting struggle of the 100 Years' War. A war not just of swords and castles, but of politics, pride, and power. Both kingdoms were exhausted. The battlefield victories had faded, and what remained was a desperate search for peace. In England, King Richard II was losing his grip on power. His throne was fragile, his enemies circling, and his kingdom dangerously divided. Across the Channel, France was no better. King Charles VI, known as Charles the Mad, ruled in name, but was trapped inside his own mind, plagued by violent episodes of insanity. That left France teetering on the edge of collapse. Their worlds were crumbling, and in a last desperate gamble to hold it all together, both courts turned to an ancient solution: marriage diplomacy. It didn't matter that the bride was a child. It didn't matter what the cost would be. All that mattered was survival, and Isabella of Valois was the bargaining chip. Isabella of Valois was born on November 9th, 1389, in the heart of Paris, a city glittering with royal palaces, yet suffocated by political chaos. She was the daughter of King Charles VI of France and Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, a child born into privilege, but also into a kingdom unraveling at the seams. Her father, Charles VI, was known across Europe as Charles the Mad. His mind, once sharp, had shattered when Isabella was still an infant. In his worst episodes, he would run screaming through the palace halls, convinced invisible enemies were chasing him. There were days when he couldn't even recognize his own wife or children, moments when his young daughter would look into her father's eyes and see a stranger staring back. This was the world Isabella grew up in, a palace echoing with footsteps of courtiers, but also the haunted silence of a kingdom afraid of its own king. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, tried to fill the void. She bought Isabella books, toys, and exotic pets, parrots, turtle doves, birthday presents, perhaps in a desperate attempt to build a fragile shield of childhood around her. But Isabeau was also a queen navigating ruthless politics. To her, daughters were bargaining chips. They were to be married off, exchanged, and sacrificed if necessary. Isabella's fate was sealed, not by love, but by strategy. The little princess spent her earliest years drifting between royal residences like the Louvre Palace, surrounded by luxury, yet carrying the quiet weight of looming responsibilities she couldn't yet name. One heartbreaking detail says everything. When Isabella was sent away to marry the King of England at just 6 years old, her mother packed her trousseau with jewels, silk gowns, silver goblets, but tucked between them were 3 dolls, their hair curled, their faces painted in royal blue. One wore a miniature wedding dress. They even gave the dolls tiny silver spoons, so Isabella could pretend to serve a feast before being handed to a man 3 times her age. The court called it elegance, but it looked a lot like cruelty dressed in lace. Even as she was forced to wear a crown, she never asked to be a queen. She never had the chance to just be a little girl. Before we move on, we want to thank you for listening. We really like making these videos and would highly appreciate it if you subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Let's move on. Isabella of Valois was not chosen for love. She was chosen because she was useful. When England and France sat down to negotiate peace, the marriage of a 6-year-old child became the centerpiece of the deal, a living, breathing contract, sealed with silk and gold. Richard II of England was desperate. His throne was crumbling beneath him, his enemies growing louder, his treasury dangerously empty. What he needed was time. What he needed was peace. And the French were willing to sell it for a price. On the other side, King Charles VI's court was equally eager. The French wanted to stop the bleeding of the 100 Years' War, to protect their trade, and to keep England from allying with powerful rivals like Aragon or Bavaria. Isabella was their bargaining chip, a child offered on the altar of diplomacy. The negotiations were cold and efficient. Her dowry was set at 800,000 francs, a staggering sum, with 300,000 francs paid immediately and the rest delivered over time. Special clauses were inserted. If Richard died before Isabella turned 12, she would receive 500,000 francs and retain all her jewelry. If the marriage was unconsummated, the French would take back the dowry and all the precious gifts. Isabella herself was listed, like property, among these terms. The Treaty of Ardres, signed in 1396, outlined every detail. There was a 3-day celebration, but beneath the grandeur, it was clear. Isabella's feelings, her future, her childhood, none of it mattered. Even by medieval standards, the deal raised eyebrows. Some English nobles questioned the wisdom of marrying a child who would not bear an heir for years. But Richard's political survival took precedence over tradition. He would mold her into his perfect queen, they said. He would educate her, shape her. The girl's age was debated like a minor inconvenience. Canon law required that marriages not be consummated before the age of 12, a rule everyone acknowledged, but treated as a technicality. Froissart, the great chronicler, recorded that when asked about the marriage, little Isabella simply replied, "I am told that then I shall be a great lady." In that moment, she was treated not as a daughter, not as a human being, but as merchandise. Her worth measured in gold, in truces, in how long she could hold 2 nations together. For the kings and diplomats, Isabella was the perfect solution. For Isabella, it was the beginning of the end of her childhood. The farewell was not a tender goodbye. It was a handover. Isabella's father, Charles VI, escorted her from Paris to the coastal town of Ardres, a formal journey lined with nobles, soldiers, and diplomats. He was lucid that day, present enough to play his part in the grand theater of royal politics. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, had carefully packed her trousseau, fine silks, glittering jewels, gold and silver vessels, and one heartbreakingly small detail, Isabella's dolls, trimmed with miniature silver utensils, tucked carefully among the crowns. Isabella was 6 years old. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She clutched the edge of her doll's dress and watched her world shrink in the distance as she was handed over to strangers. At Ardres, the French had built a city of tents, draped in banners and embroidered cloths, where French and English diplomats feasted for 3 days. Gifts flowed like water, priceless fabrics, carved treasures, sacred relics, while Isabella, the most valuable gift of all, was dressed in blue silk and carried in a cloth of gold litter to her wedding. On November 1st, 1396, in the Church of St. Nicholas in Calais, the ceremony began. English and French nobility gathered, their jewels flashing like fire in the candlelight. Chroniclers called it an assembly of goddesses. But for Isabella, it was a silent blur. She said the words she was told to say. She held out her tiny hand when they slipped the ring onto her finger. The crown they placed on her head was heavy, too heavy, and slipped slightly to one side. She glanced at her French governess, Margaret de Courcy, searching for something familiar, something safe, but found only expectation. Richard II, her new husband, was nearly 30, a king desperate for peace. To him, she was not a wife, not yet. She was a treaty, wrapped in silk. The journey to England was perilous. Some of the ships were wrecked in the Channel, but Isabella's survived. She landed at Dover, traveled through Rochester and Canterbury, stopping at Eltham, before finally reaching London. The grand procession that greeted her was so crowded that several people were crushed to death trying to catch a glimpse of the child queen. On January 3rd, 1397, Isabella spent the night in the Tower of London. The next day, she was crowned at Westminster Abbey, paraded through streets where the White Hart, Richard's emblem, fluttered from every corner. The city celebrated. England had a new queen, but Isabella had lost everything. Isabella's fairy tale was short-lived, and the end came swiftly. In 1399, while Isabella played in the gardens of her English manor, her world was quietly collapsing. Richard II, her protector, her king, and the only familiar figure in this foreign land, was overthrown by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, soon to be Henry IV. Richard was captured in Wales, paraded as a prisoner, and locked in the Tower of London. Days later, he was moved to Pontefract Castle, where he simply vanished. Some say he starved to death, left in the cold, eating rats, clawing the walls until his fingers bled. Others whispered he was beaten with a poker and buried beneath the floorboards with the blood still warm. Isabella never saw his body. No one did. What she received was silence, the kind of silence that feels like a scream. The truth was buried along with him. Isabella was 10 years old. They told her the king was dead, and she broke. She locked herself in her chambers, draped in black, and refused to eat or speak for days. Chroniclers say she cursed Henry IV openly, calling him a usurper, a butcher, the man who stole her husband and her crown. But Isabella was still a prize. Henry IV did not send her home. Not yet. She was moved like a precious chess piece, first to Wallingford Castle, then to Havering at Bower. She was stripped of her loyal attendants. Even her French governess was replaced. Henry's agents watched her every move. She was allowed to meet French ambassadors, but they were forbidden to speak of Richard's death. Henry had plans. He wanted to remarry Isabella to his son, the future Henry V, to cement his fragile reign. But Isabella, at just 11 years old, stood before the English envoys and said, "I will not marry the son of my husband's killer." The room fell silent. Women didn't say no. Children didn't say no. Queens in exile begged. They didn't resist, but Isabella did, and for a moment. A child stared down a king. Her refusal enraged the English court. Henry stalled her return to France, using her as a bargaining chip in diplomatic games. French envoys pleaded for her release. Letters were sent. Demands were made. Isabella's own letters echoed with grief and desperation. She wrote to her family that she lived in mourning, that she would never again dress in color, that she wanted nothing from England except to leave. She was a child, alone, in a cage. Finally, in 1401, after nearly 2 years of captivity, Henry IV allowed her to return to France, but not with her dowry. That he kept. As she crossed the Channel back to her homeland, Isabella was not the same girl who had once arrived with dolls and silver trinkets. She returned as a widow, a political relic, a living scar of a failed peace. The English had celebrated her as a queen. Now they discarded her as a liability, but Isabella would carry Richard's memory. and her quiet defiance for the rest of her life. When Isabella finally crossed the sea back to France in 1401, the wind off the Channel bit colder than she remembered. Gone was the girl who had arrived in England with dolls packed beside her jewels. Now, she returned in silence, draped in black, eyes dulled by sorrow, a queen in name only. Paris greeted her with pageantry, trumpets, banners, courtiers. But Isabella didn't smile. She walked through it all like a ghost, untouched by the noise. She bowed where she was told. She kissed the hand she was meant to kiss, but her gaze drifted, distant, to someplace no one else could see. The court noticed. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, urged her to rejoin the rhythms of palace life. But Isabella rarely spoke. She turned down feasts, refused new gowns. She wore mourning as if it were armor, and she did not take it off. She was 10 years old, and already she had known too much. Still, in the machinery of medieval power, grief was a delay, not a destination, and eventually, duty came knocking again. In 1406, Isabella was married once more, this time to her cousin, Charles, Duke of Orleans. He was gentle, poetic, barely a teenager himself. But it didn't matter. The alliance had been signed long before the vows were spoken. She walked to the altar in silence. Chroniclers say she wept through the ceremony. No one stopped it. The marriage was polite, formal, distant. Charles wrote love poems in later years, lines filled with longing and lyricism. But Isabella, once again, was a queen without a choice, and soon, a mother without time. In 1409 or 1410, still a teenager, Isabella died, giving birth to her only child, a daughter named Joan. The exact day was barely recorded. There was no grand procession, no court mourning, just the quiet burial of a 19-year-old girl who had once been the center of empires. She was laid to rest in the church of the Celestines in Paris. No crown, no fanfare, no king beside her, just a name, a story, and silence. In England, she was quickly forgotten, a failed treaty, a broken alliance, yesterday's queen. In France, she became a cautionary tale, whispered at court, but rarely remembered aloud. A child queen, a girl pawn, a ghost on a throne. But Isabella had not gone quietly. She had mourned Richard II when others told her to forget. She had refused to marry the son of his usurper when pressured to obey. She had worn black like a banner, carried grief like defiance, and left behind not just a daughter, but a warning that behind every royal bargain, there is a life, that even the smallest figure on the board can leave the deepest scar. Isabella of Valois was born into silken power, but never into safety. Her crown was sown with thorns, her childhood exchanged before she even knew what it meant to be a child. Her story is not just a tragic footnote of royal history. It is a mirror, held up to a society where girls were not daughters, but contracts, not children, but currency. At 6 years old, Isabella was packaged under a treaty. At 10, she was a widow, and by 20, she was gone, remembered not for who she was, but for what she represented. Peace, paid in flesh. Child marriage was not rare in medieval Europe. Among the nobility, it was policy. Girls as young as 12 were routinely married to older men to forge dynasties. But Isabella's case was extreme, even by the brutal standards of her time. Her wedding at 6 was political desperation, dressed in gold. Her tears never made it into the treaty. No sons, no crown. No one left to keep saying her name. She bore no heirs who shaped history. She made no decisive speech or battle. Chroniclers were more interested in kings and wars. Isabella, the girl, became invisible, a forgotten queen with no voice, no legacy. But today, her silence speaks louder than ever. She was a symbol of lost girlhood, a ghost in a golden dress, reminding us how power devours the innocent. Her life is a testament to the children who were used, discarded, and erased, so that kingdoms could shake hands in peace. Isabella of Valois may have vanished from the records, but in remembering her, we remember every child whose life was signed away with ink and a ring. Together. For the kings and diplomats, Isabella was the perfect solution. For Isabella, it was the beginning of the end of her childhood. If you came this far, make sure to click the next video that's on the screen right now. Subscribe to stay engaged for more content.